All right, so welcome everybody. So as I was saying yesterday, we have the privilege at ISGAP of having an incredible core group of leaders. I introduced Misha and Seema and Natan yesterday. I mentioned David. So David Harris is one of the core members of the ISGAP team. He joined us a little bit more than a year ago, which is really an honor for ISGAP. And David has really made his mark elevating our work in many ways. So David is the Vice Chair of Global Affairs of ISGAP. As many of you know, he served as the CEO of the AJC, the American Jewish Community, from 1990 to 2022. The organization was described by the New York Times, David was described by the New York Times as the Dean of American Jewish Organizations, and by the French President Sarkozy as the most effective, influential, and respected American Jewish organization. David was referred to by Nobel Prize laureate Shimon Peres, the former foreign minister of Israel. David was the foreign minister of the Jewish people. So highly acclaimed and respected leader of the Jewish community, and he also studied at UPenn and at our alma mater at St. Anthony's College in Oxford. So today, David is presenting this plenary session. The title of David's talk is 50 Years on the Front Line of Fighting Antisemitism. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Charles. Good morning, everyone. And just allow me, before I plunge into, just to share with you very briefly why, after a nanosecond of retirement, which I think lasted from the morning till the evening of October 1st, 2022, I jumped right back into the fray and chose to devote my time to ISGAP in particular because I think that this gentleman to my right was onto something quite unique and very forward-looking, certainly within the Jewish world. And in particular, the two projects, both of which have been referenced, obviously. One, Follow the Money. And I know we'll go into more detail, Charles, in the span of the next 2 weeks. That was hard-hitting, tangible, potentially transformational, and no one else was doing it, certainly not in the Jewish world that I know of. And second, unlike many in a very short attention span America, Charles was playing the long game. And this Oxford seminar, and this is my second, is illustrative of the long game. It's sometimes cumbersome and tedious, and those of us on the front lines get impatient with the speed of academia. But in a way, Edward Said encouraged Charles to do what I might call reverse engineering. And I think that's exactly what it is. While we might have preferred to be out front and let him try to reverse engineer during his lifetime, in this case, better late than never. And Charles, and for many years Charles alone, was out there as this voice in the wilderness, saying we need to do this, with people sometimes giving a polite response and sometimes simply dismissing it. So that's why I chose to come to ISGAP, and my wife, who is here, and you'll hear from her on Wednesday as well, who probably never married me for lunch and was getting nervous on October the 1st, 2022, may be feeling a bit more comfortable that lunch is out again. And we're back to breakfast and dinner as a family. I want to take you in a way through a series of thoughts on, let me call it, lessons learned from life, from 50 years, from frontline advocacy, from dabbling in scholarship but never taking the full plunge. And simply to frame this, This is, for me, a very personal story. The three people in my life closest to me, my mother, my father, and my wife, are all exhibits of anti-Semitism. They are not recipients of PhDs in contemporary anti-Semitism studies, such as it exists, Charles, or not. My mother was a refugee first from Bolshevism, and 10 years later in France from Nazism and Vichy collaboration. It's a long story. I won't share it with you, but she never managed to finish high school, and yet she received a PhD in anti-Semitism studies. My father, to Charles's earlier point about universities in Germany and Austria, my father, at the age of 16, entered the University of Vienna's Institute of Chemistry. At the age of 18, he was expelled as a Jew. And lest you think that I'm covering up for his poor academic record, in 1975, but I only discovered it after his death in 1998, he was invited back and given an honorary PhD for his work, please listen, on the synthesis of the heavy hydrogen atom from his teenage years, ages 16 to 18. I dare say he might have been a candidate for a Nobel Prize in physics on behalf of Austria, but he was a Jew, and that overruled everything else. And you'll hear my wife's story on Wednesday, but simply as a teaser, my wife was 16 years old when she became one of the 850,000 forgotten refugees, as they're called, from the Arab world. But she was born and raised in Libya as part of a Jewish minority. It's a story that I think you as scholars and practitioners need to know, because too often you don't know it only because it's not well known. So that's the backdrop to my own life experience. I want to begin this journey of lessons learned in 1924, exactly 100 years ago. And I want to read to you a headline from the New York Times, dated December 20th, 1924. Headline: Hitler tamed by prison. The essence of the article: his behavior during imprisonment convinced the authorities that, like his political organization, he was no longer to be feared. It is believed, said the New York Times, he will retire to private life, return to Austria, the country of his birth, 100 years ago. Fast forward to 1932. Harold Lasky, a name that some of you may know, a legendary social scientist at the London School of Economics, and a Jew, said the following: "The day when the Nazis were a vital threat is gone. It is not unlikely that Hitler will end his career as an old man in some Bavarian village who in the beer garden in the evening tells his intimates how he nearly overturned the Second Reich. It is comforting to live on the memory of an illusion." Franz von Papen, the Chancellor of Germany, until he ceded the post after he and Paul von Hindenburg, the President of Germany, got together and decided to put Hitler in that position on January the 30th, 1933, said, and I quote, "No danger at all," referring to Hitler. "We've hired him for our act. Within 2 months, we will have pushed Hitler so far in the corner that he'll squeak." Mind you, On March 23, 1933, less than 2 months from von Pappen's comment, Adolf Hitler not only did not squeak, but ensured the passage of the enabling legislation in the Reichstag, which allowed him subsequently to bypass the Reichstag and establish full, unchallenged power. 10 days after von Papen spoke on January the 30th, this university union, the Oxford University Union, voted 275 in favor to 153 against, and I quote, that this House will under no circumstances fight for its king and country. And that vote was subsequently adopted by the universities of Glasgow and Manchester as well. April 1933, the Secretary of State of the United States, Cordell Hull, speaking in Time magazine, then perhaps the most prominent of weekly news magazines, said, and I quote, "Mistreatment of Jews in Germany may be considered virtually eliminated." By the way, at a time, 1933, when the United States had an embassy in Berlin, when American reporters were based in Germany, in other words, when there was full access to information about what was transpiring on German soil subsequent to Hitler's assumption of power. And not to be outdone by Cordell Hull, perhaps the most prominent American journalist of his day and a German-born Jew, Walter Lippmann, wrote the following in his syndicated column. He praised Hitler as, quote, statesmanlike and, quote, an authentic voice of a genuinely civilized people. Lippmann argued that the Jews were serving as, quote, a kind of lightning rod which protects Europe, because he said oppression of German Jewry was, quote, satisfying the lust of the Nazis who feel they must conquer somebody. So this Jew in America, in effect, was willing to justify and rationalize Nazi behavior against other Jews in an effort to satisfy or appease the Nazi lust. Further, said Lippmann, and I quote, "The outer world will do well to accept the evidence of German goodwill and seek by all possible means to meet it and justify it." British Prime Minister James Ramsay MacDonald, speaking on November the 9th of the same year, 1933, said, and I quote, "I do not doubt Germany's motives. I have never doubted them, and I hope that I will never be hasty enough to doubt them." Winston Churchill, 5 years later, "The almost terrifying power that Britain is building up has a sobering effect on the rest of the world," meaning it would contain Germany. And yet, in one of the most remarkable books of that era, and one, if you haven't read, you should look for, it's become a bit of a collector's item, entitled Guilty Men, the story of British appeasement in the 1930s, their response to this Chamberlain quote was, "Hitler at least was not terrified by our," meaning British, "power." Of course, this was only one of many Chamberlain quotes. The most infamous, of course, being, "I believe it is peace for our time. Go home and get a nice, quiet sleep," after the third of his 3 visits to Germany in September 1938, when he also said that he is convinced, speaking of Czechoslovakia, and we have at least one or two people from Czechoslovakia, a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing, said Chamberlain. And then, of course, he added, I got the impression that Hitler, was a man who could be relied upon when he had given his word. And what was his word? That Czechoslovakia was all he sought. That was it. And I can go on. Edward Daladier, the French Prime Minister in Munich, together with Chamberlain, though he gets less press coverage, saying to the French people on September the 30th, quote, I am certain today that thanks to the desire to make mutual concessions and thanks to the spirit of collaboration which has animated the action of the four great powers, Germany, Italy, France, and Britain, said Daladier, peace is saved. Walter Duranty, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist for the New York Times, who we now know lied about the Ukrainian famine in his effort to defend the regime in Moscow. Speaking of Munich on November 4th, 1938, said, Munich declares to those who have ears that henceforth Germany wants peace. What's my point? My point is that if we are going to understand the times in which we live today, the times, Charles, that you shared with us earlier, that you, Michal, and Natan and Sima focused on, and all of you so brilliantly, if we're going to understand the times in which we live today, and you in particular on university campuses, we don't just have to know the facts and the dates and the quotes. We had a collective failure of imagination. It was on the universities. It was in governments. It was in the media. And believe me, I've just given you a tiny sample of the quotes that I've collected, because I believe that for any serious student of international relations, of human dynamics, of human behavior, the study of the 1930s is absolutely critical to the curriculum. Absolutely. First our own, and then more generally the classroom. Because how could it otherwise be, from the perspective of now 90 years later, that all these otherwise good people, if I may say so, Neville Chamberlain was not a bad person. He was not a malevolent person. He did not want Hitler to succeed any more than Stanley Baldwin did or James Ramsay MacDonald wanted. Nor do I believe that even the Oxford Union necessarily wanted Hitler to succeed. But they suffered from a collective failure of imagination to understand, and I think this is a key word, the extremist mindset. Chamberlain himself said more than once, he gave me his word. Gentlemen give gentlemen their word. He couldn't lie to me, because in the Harvard, Yale, Oxford, Cambridge axes, if you will, gentlemen don't lie to one another. Gentlemen tell the truth. So how could it be? How could it be that the entire intelligence amassing power of the United States, of Britain, of France, could so dramatically misread German intentions? And so I ask whether in the 2020s, are we witnessing another collective failure of imagination? Will there be seminars in 80 or 90 years, if, God willing, this country still exists, and its institutions still stand, and not just this country, but our collective Western liberal democratic institutions? And will the same kinds of quotes be read by another David Harris sitting here? While we shake our head, and for those, and we have at least one Yiddish speaker, so our friend from China can translate, say, Oy weis mir, oy gewollt, how could we fail to see it? Is that going to happen? And I, for one, who am not a gambler, but if I were, would not necessarily bet that we've learned a hell of a lot from the 1930s, the result of which, again, to state the known, Charles made the point earlier, I simply want to underscore it, the result was the annihilation of 1/3 of the entire Jewish people, 2/3 of the Jews of Europe, including 1.5 million children. Look at the agony, as Michal spoke yesterday about the Druze village, of 12 children having been killed in a Hezbollah missile attack. Maybe we understand the number 12 better than we understand the number 1.5 million. 1.5 million Anne Franks. So I wonder and I worry. And for me, speaking to you, who are graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, tenured and untenured faculty at universities in many countries around the world, to me, this is issue number one. Are our young people in these venerable institutions not only being taught what to think, but how to think, and how to think critically, and how to understand other mindsets? By the way, just as Hitler was willing to defy the common political science theories that opposition leaders say one thing, but empowered in office do something else, because, as we're told, unless they can deliver the mail and pick up the garbage, they're going to be out on their tuchus, their backside. Didn't quite work that way. To fast forward, just as perhaps we don't understand the Palestinian mindset, because from our point of view, for a hungry people, half a loaf of bread means survival. No loaf of bread presumably means famine and calamity. And yet, while David Ben-Gurion, for our hungry people, the Jewish people, was willing to forego the larger territorial ambitions for, if you will, half a loaf, the other side was unwilling and prepared to go hungry. Can we understand that mindset? Or does our Western Cartesian training and education prevent us from ultimately seeing where that mindset leads? And again, every generation has the conceit of wanting to believe that we, not they, we're at the inflection point. This is the inflection point. But I have to say, this time around, we are, I believe, at the inflection point. So, yeah, I mean, for me as a Jew, as a child of Holocaust survivors, it's very personal. But for me as a child of Western liberal democracy, it's no less personal. And that's what's up for grabs right now. The second lesson I learned, it'll be a lot shorter, so don't get nervous, from the 1930s, and one I think, again, that needs to be woven in: appeasement does not work. Not with the mindset we're talking about. This is not about two people negotiating the price of a house and coming ever closer, because at the end of the day, one wants to buy and one wants to sell. So, you know, if not the first buyer, the second. That's not this. And once again, we have difficulty processing what sound like hyperbolic assertions. Exhibit A, Dr. Charles Asher Small. Yes, you. Telling the world, a country of fewer than 350,000 citizens, thousands of miles away, Charles likes to always add of America, to the United States of America, actually believes that playing the long game, the shrewd, smart game, they can actually destabilize the most powerful liberal democracy on earth. And in a way, if you will, forgive the metaphor, hijack it. And most people, including perhaps the Walter Lippmanns of today, the Harold Laskys of today, the Cordell Hulls of today, serious people, credentialed people, will look at Charles and say, what have you been smoking? What have you been drinking? Have you fallen on your head? Poor guy. Poor guy. Pat him on the shoulder and send him off on his way. Because it can't happen. But we know, first of all, that appeasement does not work with that mindset. And how do we know? Because I look at Exhibit B, Czechoslovakia. It was the beginning, wasn't it? And it only awakened the appetite for Belgium and the Netherlands and Luxembourg and France and Denmark and Norway. And then for the Soviet Union and Poland and for Greece and for Yugoslavia, and I can keep going and going and going because more triggered more and not less. There were those who believe, and one Israeli leader was chastised in the White House for saying it some years ago, that for anyone who thinks that Israel will be the modern-day Czechoslovakia, think twice. We're not going down that road. And he was criticized in the White House some years ago for even thinking it. The third lesson that I've learned from the 30s is that when America stays on the sidelines, the liberal democratic world cannot defend itself, not when it comes to hard power. And while Europe is flush with soft power, then and now, soft power against extremist ideology makes zero impression, or as we say in Yiddish, papkes. The United States' decision to pretend that an ocean could separate us, or in fact, as it turned out, two oceans from two enemies, proved fatal. And it was interesting that when Winston Churchill was asked by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in a conversation, Roosevelt said to Churchill, "I'm looking for a name for this war." And Churchill's response was very quick, apparently. He said, "Mr. President," or Franklin, "the name? The unnecessary war." Because at so many stages between 1933 and 1939, conscription, arms buildup, Rhineland, Ethiopia, Abyssinia, Spain, Anschluss. Had there been a strong intervention by Britain, France, and yes, perhaps the United States? Churchill seemed to believe, and who am I to disagree with Winston Churchill, that war could have been prevented. So the notion of peace through strength is, again, not some right-wing talking point. It may be what could have prevented the Second World War, at least in Europe. And the fourth thing, and last thing, then, is Israel. Now, here I need very quickly to clarify lest there be any misunderstanding, Barack Obama in 2009 went to Cairo and made a big mistake. I want to say unintentionally, but mistake he made by linking the creation of the state to the Shoah. The Shoah only underscored the need for the state in a particularly dramatic way, obviously. But Theodore Herzl was not writing during the Shoah, nor, if I may say, were the founders of Judaism, including our prophets, including those who wrote Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon, where we sat, we wept when we remembered Zion. So this is not about the state of Israel being reborn as a consequence of the Holocaust, rather as a fulfillment of a millennia-long dream and a forced separation since the year 70 in the Common Era, but at the same time, as a Jew who wants to ensure that never again means never again, and not just once a year at some solemn ceremony, I cannot imagine any strategy without Israel centrally positioned, not just as an advocate and a spokesman for Jewish people, but as the defender and the haven and home that we did not have in 1938. And I simply remind us that in 1938, at the behest of the United States government, and maybe to deflect attention from American restrictionist immigration policy, the Evian Conference was organized in Evian, France. And with the exception of the Dominican Republic, none of the 30-plus countries represented by their delegations, not one was willing to accept a single Jew. And I have to add, in the decade of the 1930s, when the United States had country-specific quotas, the country quota for Germany, and then after the Anschluss for combined Germany and Austria, was fulfilled once in 10 years. Once. And not for lack of applicants. Hundreds of thousands of Jews from Germany and Austria, and obviously later others, were queuing up at a time when Hitler teased the world and effectively said, "You want the Jews? Take the Jews. Bitte. Take them. Take them." And they gathered in Evian and they gave Hitler the answer presumably he expected, and I would argue additional license to go the next step. I can't prove that, but it seems quite logical to believe. So 4 lessons: a failure of imagination, the disaster of appeasement, the distance and neutrality of the United States at a time when liberal democracy was on the line, and the absence of Israel on behalf of the Jewish people. And now I fast forward and not only ask whether these questions have been learned, but now in the midst of what we're experiencing, and I'm not going to go through the description, it's been so thoroughly covered this morning, last night, and most of you cover it daily in your work. So what can I add? But the lessons I've learned now, when we transition from description to prescription, which is our obligation, each in our own way, obviously, whether we're on the campus or in the trenches, wherever we may be, or on the campus in the trenches, or wherever we may be. The October 6th playbook must go out the window. And yet too many are still clinging to it and haven't yet understood. It may have worked partially. Whether it did or not, it's largely irrelevant today. What's the October 7th playbook? Well, number one, I would say something again painfully obvious, but it needs to be said. Anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. Despite the views of some out there, we did not create the problem, and we will not solve the problem either. We can share our insights when asked, and even when not asked. From time to time, we're not shy. But it took until 1965. So depending on whether you want to count from year 30 or year 300, Constantine, it took up to 1900 years for the Catholic Church to go through a process that we would call in Hebrew cheshbon nefesh, a kind of accounting of one's soul, and reach the conclusion during the Second Vatican Council that the Catholic Church, though it wouldn't say it in quite these terms, had made a rather unfortunate error. To its credit, though it took 1900 years and caused untold suffering, including, I would argue, the tilling of the European soil that made something like the Holocaust more fathomable to many Europeans who were not necessarily in the Einsatzgruppen, the Wehrmacht, the SS themselves, but they did it. And as one who engaged with the Catholic Church, in my case beginning in the 1980s, we have witnessed a veritable revolution. Not perfect. For those who know Poland, for example, you had a Father Jankowski, who in the presence of the then president of Poland, Lech Walesa, in Gdansk, Danzig, again spouted the old ritualistic Catholic condemnation of the Jews for all of our satanic, evil, devilish qualities. But nonetheless, starting with the Pope, and perhaps unlike the Jewish people, and for that matter, the Muslim people, at least in the Catholic Church, you have a central address. And once the Pope gives his imprimatur with the College of Cardinals, when we've witnessed it with John Paul II, with Pope Francis, with others, we saw it in the Lutheran Church. Again, it took centuries too long, with too much cost to the Jewish people. But yes, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Germany, the Lutheran Church in the United States went through their own moral reckoning, and they established a new era of relations between Jews and Lutherans. The Anglican Church, more or less the same, and I don't want to go through the full roster, but my point is only one. We cannot do it for the Catholic Church, nor can we do it for the Evangelical Church, nor can we do it for the Lutheran Church, nor can we do it for Islam. And this is a subject which is too often the elephant in the room. And yet somehow, despite the size of the elephant, the people in the room try to render it invisible. It's too tricky. I get it. One cannot collectivize or generalize about a religion of 1.5 billion or more adherents, particularly when they themselves subdivide in so many different ways, theologically, geographically, socially, otherwise. But I'll tell you this, that simply responding by saying you're an Islamophobe, to shut it down, or alternatively, as I've also heard, Islam is a religion of peace. And therefore, and this was a Belgian taxi driver who told me this after I and others were quarantined in Brussels after 2 terror attacks, and the city was shut down for several days until we were finally allowed out with police escorts and others. The taxi driver from Morocco said, "Monsieur, you don't understand. By definition, a Muslim could not commit an act of murder. So if he committed an act of murder, ipso facto, he is not a Muslim. He may call himself a Muslim, but he's not." And yet, how do we deal with this? In 2019, the Pew Research Center, so this is not a Jewish organization trying to peddle a line, published data on Muslim views of Jews in 7 countries. In Jordan, and by the way, I repeat, of Jews, not Israelis, the fact that the respondents may or may not see them as the same is not for me to try and rationalize or justify or explain. The question was deliberately asked about Jews, Yahud. 100% of those surveyed in Jordan had an unfavorable view of Jews. In Lebanon, 99%. In Egypt, 98%. In Morocco, 88%. In Indonesia, 76%. In Pakistan, 74%. In Turkey, 60%. Mind you, 2019, I can't imagine what it would be like today, but longitudinally, Pew did a similar study in 2005, and in 2005, the numbers were almost identical. Jordan and Lebanon, 99%. And then Indonesia, Pakistan, Turks, essentially the same. So I asked myself the question, and I asked myself the question as one of the authors, if I may use the word, of fostering Muslim-Jewish dialogue and cooperation during my career in the United States and around the world, and directing one humanitarian project after another to Syrian refugees, to Turkish victims of earthquakes, to Indonesian victims of the tsunami. I can keep going. I asked the question, it's bad enough that they are harboring these views in their own countries. What happens when they arrive in Germany? What happens when they arrive in France and the United States and Britain? Do they magically take a shower and wash themselves from this hatred? This hatred which came from where? Presumably, the home, the mosque, the madrasa, the media. So when Angela Merkel in 2015, and she was a fine person who cared deeply about the legacy of the Shoah and committed herself to the concept of Staatsräson, elevating the relationship with Israel to an entirely new level of strategic partnership by making it a pillar of Germany's national interest, Staatsräson. When she admitted more than 1 million Muslim refugees to Germany, I have no doubt she meant well. She wanted to reinforce the fact that today's Germany is not yesterday's Germany. And the Jewish Gemeinde, the community, was in a very awkward position. How could they oppose the entry of people who were portrayed as refugees fleeing a country and being received in this liberal democracy? And yet, these Pew statistics were not secret. We didn't have to barrel through layers of password-protected sites to get this. This is known, and much more is known. So what to do? Will there be a Nostra Aetate, a Second Vatican Council in the Islamic world? Well, in bits and pieces, yes. One can point to individual leaders. We work with many of them in my years at AJC. They exist. God bless them. It takes enormous courage. Sometimes, though, it leads them to have to leave Islam. Ayaan Hirsi Ali being a very good example of someone who in the end had to leave her native religion because her liberal democratic views, which evolved in the Netherlands and then the United States, could no longer coexist. So, will this come? My first point again, whether it's in the field of religion, whether it's elsewhere, we Jews cannot create the Pfizer vaccine. It's the non-Jewish world that has to follow the examples that I've offered, and others, time not permitting, to do so. The second lesson I've learned is never weaponize anti-Semitism. And I say this from having watched it being weaponized and instrumentalized time and time again. The left will agree that anti-Semitism is an issue and obsess about the right, and in the case of the United States, point to Charlottesville and Pittsburgh and Poway, in the case of Germany, to Halle and elsewhere. And the conversation stops. And the right will point to the left and indicate the campuses. The students on your campuses, by and large, do not fear the Ku Klux Klan marching across the quad, but rather this harder to define, harder to identify, almost a kind of radon gas, because they're not marching straight down the street chanting, "Jews will not replace us, blood and soil." It's a little more complicated, but ISGAP has been deconstructing it, and you have as well. But we have to be swivel-headed. If we're serious about anti-Semitism, whether in government, in NGOs, in Jewish organizations, on the campuses, we cannot selectively call out what's safest or most convenient or most consistent with our own worldview. It comes from the far right and the not so far right sometimes. It comes from the far left and the not so far left. It comes from jihadism, and sometimes it comes from other places. Jersey City, New Jersey. 2 black Hebrews claiming to be the authentic Jews and accusing other Jews, including their targets in that kosher shop, of being imposters. Imposters. What do we do with that? And one member of Congress, Rashida Tlaib, immediately tweeted after Jersey City, "White supremacy kills." 3 words. Until the authorities arrested the 2 and discovered it was something totally different. By the way, there was a similar event in Monsey, New York, in the home of a rabbi during Hanukkah, in which one of the victims eventually died from knife wounds or machete wounds. Rashida Tlaib, and yes, I am singling her out very consciously, deleted her tweet and showed no further interest in the identity of the anti-Semites who entered that kosher food shop, because it didn't serve the political purpose any more than Marjorie Taylor Greene on the other side, in the same Congress, under the same roof, accused Jews of employing space lasers to trigger wildfires in California. And by the way, in terms of prescription, let me slip in. And why are both political parties in the United States tolerating this? Why are they tolerating this? Expel them. Let them go off as independents. If they win, they win. It's no longer the problem of either party. But not only do both parties continue to house them, but because of the incumbency rule, the leaders of both parties have been supporting their re-elections with funds. We have one who spoke about the Benjamins, Jews and money, that classic, Jews and space lasers. And these people still have a D and an R after their names in the House of Representatives of the United States. And the other piece of this lesson learned is don't underestimate ever the lethality of anti-Semitism. It's, in today's world, sometimes it's hard to process. Let me try to be fair. Jews, by and large, are successful. By the way, to Charles's earlier point about success and failure and wealthy neighborhoods and not so wealthy neighborhoods, please correct me, but I believe that today, Indian Americans are the wealthiest identifiable ethno-national group in the United States. I don't see that yet as a reason or pretext or justification to launch a massive anti-Indian and attach all the other descriptive words one wishes to demonize, to isolate Indian Americans for having achieved the success which they thought was America's opportunity. Not America's promise, America's opportunity. But Jews, by and large, with some notable exceptions, are successful. And yes, some Jews live in Beverly Hills and some Jews live in the Hamptons, even as we speak. And yes, some Jews are seen as having white skin, so by definition, they are removed from the victimization hierarchy list. And yet, I think it's our job to remind our settings, our classrooms, our constituencies, that anti-Semitism is ingenious, it is creative, it is persistent, it is resilient, and it is lethal, left unchecked. And finally, the word that every audience wants to hear, the Jewish response, I believe, to all this, and I've said this now for a very long time, at least in my book, is to be more Jewish. I'm not going to put billboards up on highways saying, please like me. I'm not even going to remind people that, but for Jews, polio might be ravaging all of our children. And I can offer 1,000, 10,000 other examples of how the Jews have made the world a better place, and we have. And not just in technology, but in a moral foundation for an amoral, if not immoral, world that preceded the Jews, perhaps the greatest single contribution of the Jewish people, for which, of course, we are by some resented. But my answer is be more Jewish, act more Jewish, do more Jewish, study more Jewish, and embrace Israel even more. I'm not saying that all of us are going to live without fear or anxiety or concern. It's not pleasant if you're sitting on the subway in New York City, and I think you mentioned the subways, Charles, to hear someone stand up and brazenly say, all masked, Zionists, off this. You're better off outside this car. Not easy for any of us or any of the other situations. But I'll be damned, and this is my closing comment, to witness the Jews begin to follow the example of the Marano Jews. Those Jews who publicly, externally hid their identity, not to call attention to themselves, not to run risks, to let the Spanish and the Portuguese believe that the Jews had gone or embraced Jesus, or simply vanished. No. No more hidden curtains, no more hidden identities. We have our state reborn, God bless it. We have a Jewish community that at its core, not at its fringes, at its core, someone once likened it to a jelly donut. It's a strange analogy. But at its core, it is rich and sweet and united in raspberry jam or custard cream, but the edges break away very quickly. So for those of us who are part of that custard cream or raspberry jam, make it stronger. So thank you, ISGAP, for this opportunity, and I look forward to the next period of conversation.
Well, thank you very much, David, for, as always, inspiring and insightful presentation. So we have 30 minutes for Q&A. Robert, and then
Thank you.
Mark.
My question, I raise my voice. Thank you. Well, I didn't have the opportunity to thank you for your first presentation, which was good. And thank you, Dr. Harris. I have a kind of an observation, especially regarding the position of the United States. And I'll align it with what Charles said. You know, when we speak about the United States not taking position or standing on the side, it's not about the United States only, it's about other countries as well. And let me just go in detail just a little bit. What we are facing now, you know, many threats, but two threats which I deem myself very dangerous to the Jewish and others, is that you have transnational threat, not nationalist threat. Mainly the first one is white nationalism, and the second one is Islamism. With white nationalism, really what you have now, what happened in Norway, what happened in New Zealand, what happened in Paris, what happened in Pittsburgh, mainly you have a convergence, and convergence is that you know, you have a philosophy that emerged from France, Grand Replacement or the Great Replacement, and which they blame the Jews for it. The second one, as a matter of fact, Islamism. Islam, yes, it's a universal religion, but something which is sad what's happening with Islam is that one tenet in Islam is about the da'iyah, mainly to propagate Islam. And what's leading this, they are the Islamists and the Salafists. And the Islamists and the Salafists, they are against the Jews. They go back to the story of the Jews, how they wanted to hinder the message of Prophet Muhammad from that time. And they relate it to today, as a matter of fact. So really, mainly, they are against the Jews, and the creation of Israel itself is, as a matter of fact, something to undermine Islam. So this is why you have these genocidals. So my question for the United States, what do you expect the United States to do really on its own? And let me go more precise, as a matter of fact. I was a researcher for the government, mainly, I would say, on contract, let me say, to create a socio-political profile before the U.S. invasion of Iraq, you know. And something I worry about the United States is that, and you ask yourself this question, ask it, is it better to do certain things to expect certain bad consequences, or to do nothing and expect no consequences? This is one thing which is very important here as we deal with the policies. And when it comes to Europe, and this is sadly in Europe and Great Britain and everybody else, and I wrote about it, mainly it's about, you know, how liberal democracies allow Salafism and Islamism to have such a place and to exploit democracy to go ahead and propagate their vision. And by the way, my last, sorry to take this, when you mentioned this new research on Christian, did you know about Lebanon and about 99%? This is absolutely wrong. I come from a Maronite Christian background. My father was pro-Jewish. I still remember when I was 12 years old and less, during the war, my father and my uncle said, listen, God forbid us, and if Israel loses that war. So, and now, if you look now what's happening, you know, many Christians, as a matter of fact, they are asking, wanted to align themselves with Israel as before, and even the patriarch of the Maronite Church. He mentioned Hezbollah, what they are doing is terrorism, and held goes against them. So I don't know, when you mention this few and 99%, because I come from that background, whom did they go and ask about it? Probably they went to Hartakai, sir, and ask this.
Thank you,
And I
sir.
thank you.
Okay, take one or two more questions. So,
So we have Mark next.
Mark?
Thank you.
And then Julio. And if you could please be brief, concise questions so David can answer.
I think the problem is concise answers, not concise
Thank you
questions.
very much. I would just like to ask you, encourage you to make some, maybe like a clarification about something you said before, because like what you explained, I think it was like very clear to everybody, but it could be taken out of context, and I think it would be important to hear from you as like also a leader to make a clear statement about that. You said before in your speech, do not weaponize anti-Semitism. And
I'm sorry?
you said like do not weaponize anti-Semitism. And I think you explained very clear what you meant, that people try to use this charge to, the left try to use this to delegitimize the left, and the left is the right. There are the real anti-Semites and there, the real anti-Semites and we are not, right? But there is actually a charge out there that's a charge of anti-Semitism is being weaponized to silence criticism of Israel. And there's actually empirical research which shows that this is not the truth, and this is basically the opposite of what it claims to be, namely a strategy to legitimize Israel-related anti-Semitism, right? So I think it would be just important to hear from you that that's not what you meant, and that we, you know, that there's not like this weaponization or this charge of weaponization of anti-Semitism to silence criticism of Israel, that this is something that is actually empirically not corroborated, and something that is actually used to legitimize Israel-related anti-Semitism.
Thank you.
One more, maybe. Thank you, sir.
Julio.
Hello, David. Thank you very much. Yes, of course, I remember Halle. I was there in Germany, in the synagogue in Yom Kippur when that happened, at the other side of the country, in Düsseldorf. I was also in Germany when in the city next to Germany, in Cologne, the new mosque was inaugurated, and they asked permission for the city hall for make a public call for prayer. You know, like you would expect in the Middle East from the minarets, right? And the next day there was a column of German Muslims trying to prevent this to happen, calling the authorities, are you mental, are you out of your mind? We just come from this totalitarianism for you to export it here for us to fight it again and escape again. And they understand perfectly, so Jews we're not the victims, we're the victims, we're not to blame for anti-Semitism, we're the victims, and we don't have to sort of argue with anti-Semites how to deal with it. And I also agree with within the Islamic world, there's nothing like separation between church and state, there's nothing like Second Council Vatican. So what is it that we as a global community, what is it that we need to wait for happening? What is it that we do in the face of it? We cannot just sit with crossed arms and wait, right? What is our global strategy in the face of what to expect? You just said that we need to really try to read well the hints of history, to prevent things like Holocaust or the war happening. So what is it that we need to expect? What is it that we need to do as a global community? Thank you.
Okay. In honor of the Hebrew language, I'll go from right to left. Julio. I don't pretend to have a monopoly of wisdom on how to address this vast issue of how to create the Second Vatican Council or anything like it within this sprawling Muslim world, but I'll tell you this. Number one, we have increasingly positive models that do exist. They're not simply in the laboratory. They exist. The UAE. If one visits Abu Dhabi, one will see today 3 houses of worship, beautifully constructed, sensitively constructed, equally constructed, a church, a mosque, and a synagogue. In the UAE, Holocaust education has been introduced into the school system. And in the UAE, the peace with Israel is not a piece of paper, but at least until now offers some promise of a street-to-street, people-to-people peace. Maybe I'm being overly utopian, I hope not, but I have to cling to something. Bahrain is more or less where the UAE is. Even Saudi Arabia, which I first visited, I can now say very quietly, invisibly, in the early 1990s. In my most recent visit, and we were there together with my wife, some would say the change is glacial. I would say the change is astonishing. Given where the country started, it offers some hope. There's no certainty because there's no liberal democratic infrastructure to ensure continuity. It's still whimsical. It depends on the ruler of the day. But it's going in the right direction. And in my first visit, the word Jew could never be mentioned, even though I was there as a Jew. I wasn't there as a sightseer, I assure you. In my most recent visit, they couldn't stop talking about all of the archaeological findings that link Saudi Arabia to Jewish history. And even the word Israel could be said and not whispered. So there are certain models. Azerbaijan, again, these are not perfect democratic models, I get it, but if I'm going to take a purist approach to this issue and demand alignment on 100 issues before I accept change, I'm dead in the water. I might as well go back and become a dentist or a shoemaker. But there are Albania. Albania was perhaps the one country in Europe that was occupied first by the Italians, then by the Germans, that ended the war with a larger Jewish population than it began, because of a concept called Besa, a code of honor. And Albania was at least 50% Muslim. So I'm not prepared to speak about this hopeless cause. It's real. I tasted it. I'm not alone. Others have as well. Some of you may have seen when we took 62 of the top Muslim leaders in the world, led by a mutual friend of ours, from Mecca to Auschwitz in January of 2020. Al Arabiya, Al Jazeera, the New York Times, the BBC, it was covered by everyone. And afterwards, we went to the synagogue in Warsaw, and Dr. Alisa, the head of the delegation, said to the world from that bima, from that podium, those who seek to deny the Holocaust today are modern-day fascists or Nazis. There is hope. On the other hand, I applaud Germany now for adding to their citizenship test a question which does not exist in the American citizenship test or any other that I know. Michal, the question is, do you accept Israel's right to exist? For God's sakes, and this has been our message, my message to European friends for years, defend your values. That's not a right-wing statement. You've achieved the highest level of society known to humankind. Can it be better? Of course it can. But compared to every other form we've seen, why are you so spineless? Why are you jellyfish in the face of people who are fleeing to your country, not from your country? Where's the social contract that speaks not only of what we're going to do for you, language training, vocational training, housing, what about what you're going to do for us? My mother, my father, my wife were all refugees and immigrants to the United States. It was a social contract, unwritten but understood. Lifelong gratitude to America. My father put on the American uniform. He served in espionage in the OSS the last years of the war. It's a very long story. Gratitude. In a world of tattoos, my parents would have written gratitude on their forehead. That's it, one word, gratitude. France. France said, we have les valeurs républicaines. We're not going to compromise. Your burqa does not conform with our Republican values. You want to wear your burqa? We respect it. Go live in Morocco. We are France. Gaddafi came when he was head of Libya, and he said, no wine at the table. I know it sounds trivial, and the French said, F you. F you. You don't want wine? Don't drink it. We're not forcing you to drink the wine, but you're coming to tell us in our own country what we should eat and drink, how we should dress or comport ourselves? F you.
This is what I saw in Germany. The people were telling them what to do, and then the Muslim dialogistic voices were silenced. And we've seen this across Europe.
But Julio, I'll tell you this, and there are other questions that I know. But if this to me layers onto what Charles was saying earlier, if the mainstream politicians, the center of politics in Western liberal democracies, does not defend core values, then don't be surprised when you have I Fratelli in Italy and National Rally in France. And don't be surprised. And don't ask yourself, did it just drop from the sky? There's nothing wrong with saying that in our country, we do not accept female genital mutilation. We do not accept polygamy. We do not accept the fact that women may be pulled out of school at 14 so that they're not fully educated. We don't accept it. To me, it's not a right-wing position. Michal, it's a classic liberal position that defines liberal democracies. And I would add, as a Jew, that we are fighting not just for ourselves, we're fighting for something bigger, and we should have more allies as a consequence. Mark, I hope I didn't say it, because I certainly don't think it. I don't think you heard me say it. Thank you, though, for giving me the chance to repeat the fact that I didn't say it. I'm talking about weaponizing anti-Semitism as you described. I never mentioned Israel in this context. Natan Sharansky explained once again the 3 Ds. I fully subscribe to his 3 Ds. And I have to tell you, as someone who has literally been in thousands of diplomatic meetings, because that was my work, over nearly 50 years, this is a straw man argument. You know, the other side raises it to elicit sympathy for themselves. You know, we can't speak about Israel because we're immediately accused of being anti-Semitic. Are you kidding me? Do you think that any French president or foreign minister or Spanish president or foreign minister that we or others met with paused for a moment and said, I'm not going to criticize the settlements, I'm not going to criticize Bibi Netanyahu, I'm not going to criticize the IDF or whatever else is the issue du jour, because this Jew is going to accuse me of anti-Semitism? Absurd. ridiculous, unfounded, and a deliberate distraction. And Robert, yours is a bigger question. Pew is a great name. I cannot speak to the methodology. But you raise a great question. I don't know the answer to it, but I'll say this. For me, in dealing with how to deal with this region, my answer begins with a 4-letter word. You know what it is? Iran. And here again, you deserve a longer, bigger answer, but here only the United States can lead a Western coalition, if you will, that can ultimately confront Iran in whatever way is necessary. And no, Ben Rhodes, the malicious speechwriter and aide to Barack Obama, tried to frame this dichotomously. You either support our deal in 2015 or you're a warmonger. No, I didn't support the deal in 2015. It had more holes than Swiss cheese. And no, I'm not a warmonger, because I come from a family that's a product of war. There was a third way, but he didn't want us to see it, and so we're stuck. But if we want to continue to issue from the State Department strong statements about the Houthis and the Hezbollah and Hamas without addressing the root of the problem, the strength of the problem, the spine of the problem, we're kidding ourselves. You know that.
Absolutely, I agree with you. And the point is that our invasion of Iraq, though I supported it, turned out to be a strategic blunder.
I agree.
So, Angela?
Thank you. Hi. My question has to do with what you said before about the people who had been accused of posing as Jews by people who were posing as Jews. I come from Brazil.
Come from where?
Brazil.
Brazil?
Yeah.
I've heard of that.
Good things, I expect. I am the head of the Countering Antisemitism program for the Jewish Brazilian Confederation. And just after October 7th, there were 2 or 3 threats of anti-Semitic attacks in Brazil, in our capital city of Brasilia, and the surrounding cities. The thing is, what we have in Brazil nowadays, and is something I wish we will address more throughout this program, is about philo-Semitism, especially coming from evangelical groups, neo-Pentecostal groups. This is a trend that's been rising in Brazil for the past, I'd say, 20 years. And the institutions that were said to be attacked after October 7th around Brasilia were not synagogues, but neo-Pentecostal churches that poses as synagogues. So they have all the shebang in front of them, like menorahs in front of the front doors, and most of the congregants wear all the Jewish outfits. So when you look at them and you see them on the streets, you might mistake them for Jews. And this is why these places were being targeted. My question, as a person who's deeply involved in this for the Jewish Brazilian Confederation with anti-Semitism, were there to be an attack because there were just the threats, but were one of these places to be really attacked, a bomb or something like that, what should a Jewish response to these people be? Because the thing that concerns me is that they pose as Jews, and for some reason they call us Orthodox Jews. Like they describe themselves as Jews, and they call us Orthodox Jews. This would have been an anti-Semitic attack, but not to Jews.
I think I got it. Thank you.
So I'm going to ask the last question, because we're running out of time. I'm going to give you 4 minutes to respond. I'm going to ask the question.
Okay.
You mentioned Obama's speech in Cairo. So he broke with tradition. He didn't go to Canada or to the United Kingdom. He went to Cairo. And in the Cairo speech, I thought this was a watershed moment in the United States. He invited the Muslim Brotherhood as honored guests to that lecture, to the point where Mubarak and the government didn't attend in their own capital. In this speech, he spoke about Israel being born out of the Shoah. No historical, cultural connection to the land. And then he went on to say that the Palestinians should adopt the civil rights model, i.e., that Israelis were white and the Palestinians were African American. And yet, you were very diplomatic in your description of this moment. He is a good friend of Rashid Khalidi. He comes out, Obama was, the smartest man in the room 9 times out of 10. He comes out of Ivy League universities.
Right.
How do you deal with anti-Semitism when the universities and the Democratic Party are kind of under this worldview which is deeply rooted? It's not just the superficial covering lectures of political leaders, but it's deep into the intellectual and political discourse of the United States.
And now I have 2.5 minutes because you started with 4 minutes.
You'll have 4.
Angela, first of all, I have to say that what you specifically described, I certainly knew about the surge in evangelical churches in Brazil as a political movement, and that part I know. I did not know about these particular sites you're talking about. And then you, of course, you did something which any diplomat would immediately sidestep. You said, what if? And most diplomats will immediately respond, we can't answer a hypothetical question. If it happens, we'll deal with it. But in the meantime, since I'm only a pseudo-diplomat, I would simply say that any bombing pretty much answers the question. Any bombing that is considered an act of terror, hatred, bigotry, any bombing, whether of a mosque, a church, an evangelical church, a synagogue, a quasi-synagogue, deserves unconditional condemnation. Like Michal, I'm a classic liberal. I don't mean liberal on the political spectrum per se, but I believe in live and let live. And the kind of world in which I want to live does not accept or rationalize or ignore bombings of people, whether I agree with their faith or not. It's irrelevant to me. It's irrelevant. To Charles's question, you again accuse me of being diplomatic. I'll be less diplomatic. And please understand, for those of you whom I've never met before, I've been a lifelong nonpartisan in the United States. I'm an advocate for the Jewish people, Israel, and liberal democracy. That's my writ, my portfolio. Even my mother, until she died in 2018, never knew who I voted for, because I felt it was completely inappropriate to discuss it. But on issues related to the Middle East, nothing else I'm talking about, Barack Obama was a complete and utter failure. And because he had that Obama vibe, and he was cool, and he was hip, and he was younger, and he was our first African-American president, he got lots of passes by many. But when you look back, and I'm just confining it to the Middle East, I'm not talking about Asia, Africa, Latin America, much less the United States itself. He got that wrong. He got the Muslim Brotherhood wrong. He got the Syrian Red Line wrong, big time, big time. He got Iran wrong. He got Turkey and Erdogan wrong. I can go down a long list. He got them all wrong. He got them all wrong. His one legacy in the region was the JCPOA of 2015. And we're all paying the price for the JCPOA of 2015. So I know you slipped in something at the end there, Charles, and I'd simply say at the end, you mentioned the Democratic Party, and I'll say this. For me, and I hope not just for me, we need both political parties in the United States to stand with the U.S.-Israel relationship. And it doesn't matter who I vote for, or who you, if you're American citizens, vote for. That's your prerogative. God bless you. But on this one, When the pendulum swings in a liberal society, and it inevitably does from here to here and back again, I don't want to sit with spilkes. Do you know the word spilkes? This is my interpreter here. Spilkes, nerves, anxiety, worry, because all of a sudden we have a Jeremy Corbyn type in the White House, and we have to figure out how we survive the next 4 years or 8 years until the pendulum swings back. And we have too many examples in the Western world today of that wide pendulum swing. America is unique to the life of the state of Israel. There is no substitution. There is no great replacement theory, to use it in a different context. We spent much of my career in diversifying Israeli foreign policy. India, Greece and Cyprus, Azerbaijan, lots and lots of others, the Arab world. But nothing replaces the United States. Our adversaries know it no less than we. They saw vulnerability in one political party. They've driven a wedge. You saw it when Netanyahu spoke. How many were there? How many were not there? How many who were there stood? How many sat? How many applauded? How many kept their hands like this? In one party. If you're a Republican, maybe you had Schadenfreude. But I'm telling you, as a friend of the relationship, there's no room for Schadenfreude. We, friends of Israel in the United States, Jews and non-Jews alike, have our repair work to be done in the Democratic Party today. And we cannot assume the Republican Party is on automatic pilot either. Because our adversaries know, drive a wedge between Washington and Jerusalem and all bets are off. In the strategy, Seema, that you laid out there so beautifully on those screens, I would add one. Drive a wedge between the U.S.-Israel relationship, have someone in the Oval Office of the White House instruct our ambassador to the United Nations sitting in the Security Council not to veto a legally binding under Chapter 7 resolution injurious to the State of Israel, an arms ban, a travel ban, and Israel's on its own. They know it. They want to achieve that day. We know it. We're going to do our damnedest to make sure that day never comes.
David, thank you. So we have Michal. 30 seconds, Michal, and then El Shaddai has an important...
30 seconds just to say...
Hold on.
Michal, you have a...
Just to say that a lot of questions that were asked and are so important, and I'm not going to be here for the rest, and I'm sure you'll talk about this, but the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism in response to every one of the questions, right? The politicization, how do we avoid it? Well, there's one definition. It doesn't matter if it comes from the extreme right, the extreme left, the extreme Islam. One definition of anti-Semitism. The not politicizing being sort of, or not weaponizing being a tool, well, in that IRA definition, it says right after the neat little box, criticism of the state of Israel. That is, of course, not anti-Semitism if it's criticism like of any other country. What is anti-Semitism is delegitimization, negating its very right to exist. So the IRA, the centrality of the IRA working definition, I can't overstate it, and what we see is the tsunami and pushback on the IRA working definition. I can't understate the danger of it in response to all of these questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michal.
El Shaddai has some comments for you. Everybody, please pay attention. Where are you going to go in the afternoon?